You come home from work or school and all you want to do is play the guitar. You plug in, nothing. You open it up and you realize that there's a wire off the output jack. No sweat, you think. I got a soldering iron, I can make this work. 2 hours later, you've got burned wire, burned finish, burned fingers. You've got gobs of solder and the thing still doesn't work. Soldering is a very big deal. And with just a couple of tools, a little bit of knowledge, and some practice, by the end of this video, you're going to know how to do it. I realize that soldering might seem a little mundane, a little bit boring, but believe me, it's not. There's a lot of cool things that are going on in here when we solder. We have our solder, which is made up mostly of tin, a little bit of copper, and then there's a core that's made up of rosin. That rosin acts as our flux. The base metals in most components are typically copper, brass, aluminum, steel that's plated in tin, or even pot metal for casings for the backs of potentiometers. Those are made up of alloys like tin, aluminum, and some copper, just really inexpensive things to be able to mass produce. Metal, once it's exposed to air, will form an oxide layer. That oxide layer will prevent our solder from adhering to our component. When we heat the solder, what happens, that flux will hit the component and it will clean all of that oxide layer off. When that happens, the solder is allowed to flow or to wet. Wetting is whenever the oxide layer has been cleaned by the flux and it will start to flow. The flux can actually lower the surface tension of the molten metal and allow it to flow and even out a little bit better, making a prettier and more even solder joint. Here's where the cool part happens. That solder, whenever it flows onto the component, the metals in the molten solder, the tin, interact with the base metals of our component. It forms a thin layer, a new alloy. That new alloy is called an intermetallic compound. It's that intermetallic compound that allows the solder to stick. It allows the components, the wire, all of this stuff to stick together and to be conductive with each other. Basically, it's the thing that makes your guitar sound as good as it possibly can. Bet you didn't realize there was all that cool stuff, huh? I think it's cool. To do this, we need some tools. So to start with, we're going to need a soldering iron, preferably one that goes at least to about 700 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit. We need something that gets hot. Also, there should be a sponge with your soldering iron to be able to keep the tip clean. Go ahead and get some water on that now. We will need some wire strippers, solder. We will need some needle nose pliers, and I'm also going to use a small vise. We will need some wire. To get started, heat up your soldering iron. If you have one with a temperature gauge on it, that's really, really great. Now that we got all the nerdy, sciencey stuff out of the way, let's actually solder something. I'm going to use a pot, probably a pot metal case here, as well as potentially pot metal terminals for all I know. Here we're using 22 gauge AWG American wire gauge is what that stands for, stranded PVC coated. So this means the stranded means that there's a bunch of tiny little wires here that make up our wire gauge. I'm only going to strip back about 100 thou or 0.125 or so, not much. I don't need a bunch of wire showing. That wire could end up touching other components, shorting things out and cause other problems. So the least amount of wire showing, the better. So I need to tin this. Tinning is the process where we're actually going to wet the end of this wire. We're going to flow or impregnate all of those strands of wire with solder. I've got my soldering iron tip clean. I'm going to heat my wire and then I'm going to flow solder in. As I do, that intermetallic compound happens here inside of the wire. I'm going to do the same thing for the pot. I am going to tin this lug right here as if it was going to be the input for a volume control. So I heat up that lug or terminal. I flow or wet some solder in there. That's all the solder I'm going to need. To connect these two, I just have to re-wet the solder or reflow the solder. Before I do, I'm going to re-tin the tip of my iron, meaning I'm just going to put a little bit of molten solder on there. That'll help to make the solder flow a little quicker so that I don't have to stay on here so much. I flow that. I do not blow. If I blow, I can introduce moisture into this join, and that could cause a cold solder join. A cold solder join, it might work, it may not, it could be intermittent. You'll notice it usually will have a little bit of a cloudy appearance as opposed to a shiny, almost chrome-like appearance. If I need to solder to the back of the pot, I can do the same thing. I can grab some more wire. Here, I will use a different color wire. I'm going to strip back some of the casing. I will tin this here. I'm going to float what I call a puddle, or wet a little puddle. So whenever I touch this, that flux gets on there, it cleans off that oxide layer, allowing my solder to flow. I'll re-tin the tip of my soldering iron. When I put the soldering iron on the back of the pot case, I want to have as much of the surface area touching as I can. That way the pot heats up quickly. I don't want to leave the iron on too long because I don't want to overheat the pot. If I overheat the component, I can damage it. Remelt that, flow in my tinned wire, hold that and let it re-solidify. Good, pretty solder joint. Those solder joints, if I yanked on them, that pot should break before the solder joint does. Here are some things you may run into, particularly if you're trying to put a ground wire onto a spring claw for, say, a Floyd or a strap vibrato. You may not be able to get the solder to stick. That's because there's usually a plating or some sort of coating on that claw. I will take some 320, 220, or just a little bit of sandpaper, and I'll scuff that up so I can get through that plating or that coating and allow the solder to wet and to flow on there. If you're doing pickups, you may notice you can't get solder to stick to the base plate of a pickup. That base plate may be made of stainless steel. If it is, you're going to need a different type of solder to make that happen. If you can't seem to get the solder to wet, turn up the heat. You may be running too cold. So remember, hot iron, strip back just a little bit of wire. Tin both the wire and the component. Keep that soldering iron tip clean. Do not blow on the solder. We don't want to create a cold solder joint. Don't glob the solder on. Once you've tinned the component and tinned the wire, that's typically all you're going to need. Practice. Be patient. You can do this. Trust me. Don't be scared of it. What's the worst thing you can do? Mess up? I do it constantly. So do it again. No big deal. Have you been scared at solder before? If you have, let me know. If you're an expert at soldering, let me know. Comment, down there. If you have any tips, tricks, anything like that, please comment that stuff below. Thank you guys so much. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Next week, we'll take a look at how this thing actually works. We'll take one apart. Cool? I'll see you then.